Today, this afternoon, we're going to remember Tom Kettle, which I think is particularly important. 15 years ago, I was asked by a friend of mine to come and visit a house and take away some books which were heading for the skip. And one of the books that I found was a first edition of The Ways of War by Tom Kettle. Also sitting down behind the bookshelf were two Boer War medals, not in that quite good condition, and they belonged to a guy called Private Maurice Donovan from the Durham Light Infantry. Both Maurice Donovan, who had no family, this was the end of the road for this particular family. I was there because the lady who was the executor of the will had invited me to come along. Maurice Donovan was on his way to the skip. Tom Kettle was on his way to the skip. And in the historical context, everything to do with both of them, as it pertained at that particular time, was about to find its way into the skip. A tragedy averted, because fortunately I managed to get my hands on both. I was involved at the time with a project called The Great Sacrifice. We were trying to identify all of the people from Cork City and County who had died in the Great War. And we accounted for just under 4,000 of them, which was unknown at that particular time. And on the very last page, page 673, I put in a piece from Tom Kettle, and I'm going to read it. It says, "History will write of us that we began nobly, but that our purpose corrupted. The great war for freedom will not indeed have been waged in vain, that is already decided, but it will have but half kept its promise. Blood and iron will have been once more established as the veritable masters of men, and nothing will open before the world save a vista of new war." World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, Kosovo, and anything else you want to include, including Ukraine. So in his own way, Tom Kettle was a visionary, he was a philosopher, and he was also a realist, which in the context of the First World War at that particular time was a rarity. I'm very glad I included that in that book because it made it complete. And while Kettle had nothing particularly to do with Cork other than the fact that he visited it doing recruiting speeches, it was highly appropriate that he should have the last word in that particular book, which has in fact stood the test of time. I was also fortunate to be in Thiepval on the 1st of July 2016 when Kettle was mentioned, and it was quite appropriate that he should have been mentioned. But let's be clear, that was an event which was organised primarily by the Commonwealth Graves and the BBC. Yes, our president was there, but it was, for all intents and purposes, a British event. So was that. That was the 3rd of September 2016 at Guillemot. That was organised by the Somme Association in Belfast, who are a fantastic organisation. I'm in the middle of that there somewhere. It's a smaller group, but we remembered Tom Kettle and all of the rest of them on that particular day. And on the 9th of September 2016, I wrote in the Irish Times, among other things, that Tom Kettle was a truly great Irishman of whom we should all be immensely proud. That is a minority view in this country. Let's have absolutely no doubt about that. But I firmly believe it to be true. So we remember Tom Kettle, but if we put a question mark after the title, we open up a completely different conversation. Today we will remember Tom Kettle and what he did. But if we want to talk about remembering Tom Kettle going forward, then that question mark becomes extremely relevant. And it's a challenge not alone for those of us who are here, but for our country as well, especially when we consider the type of historical narrative which is taught in our schools. So there's two aspects to this. We'll remember Tom, the man and the soldier, and then we'll look at the narrative and we'll look at the legacy. And I just want to run through this, and I don't want to put too much text on the screen, but just to give us a sense of who this person was. Born in 1880, went to Clongowes, went to university, was the auditor of the L&H. You don't arrive at that particular appointment unless you have something to offer. He travelled in 1900 in Europe. His health wasn't well. His health wasn't well throughout, not helped by excessive bouts of drinking from time to time. He entered politics in 1903 and qualified as a barrister 2 years later. And the following year he was elected by 18 votes in East Tyrone as a Member of Parliament. Then he became the Professor of Economics in the Royal University, what is now UCD, but stood down a couple of years later due to ill health, but he remained active in politics and was intensely involved in the negotiations to try and terminate the lockout in 1913. So that's Tom Kettle. We could spend 2 lectures going through that in detail. We don't have the time, and it's not necessary. This is just a poster or a piece from the newspaper at the time, a lecture on the foundations of industrial peace by somebody who knew something about it, because he was, after all, the Professor of Economics, Tom Kettle, and that was in Limerick. But the other thing that he was doing continually throughout his life was he was writing, and writing in a very philosophical way about all aspects of Irish life as it pertained at that particular time. The Open Secret of Ireland is probably one of the most famous ones, of course, but nobody reads it. And it is his vision for Ireland going forward from that particular time and how it was going to evolve. And we'll talk about that as we go on. When he got involved in politics, he was immersed in home rule politics because his father was a very prominent home rule politician. And he also knew and met Michael Davitt, as did Willie Redmond. Both Tom Kettle's father and Willie Redmond's father instinctively inculcated in both of their sons an understanding of what Davitt and the Land League were all about. And it's to be found in a lot of his thinking thereafter. He was a supporter of John Redmond's. He was a colleague of Willie Redmond's, and Willie Redmond actually took his seat in 1910 in East Tyrone when he stood down. And his political objective was an independent Ireland within a European context. How interesting. And where are we today? At least, if we forget about protocols and all the other stuff that's going on up north, at least for the rest of it, it's an independent Ireland within a European context. And that's what Tom Kettle was looking for and advocating for 100 years ago and a little bit more. And he welcomed the Third Home Rule Bill, not as a complete solution to the Irish political problems at that particular time, but as a step to go on and achieve other things. He said his only programme for Ireland consisted in equal parts of Home Rule and the 10 Commandments, because he was devout Catholic. My only counsel to Ireland is that to become deeply Irish, she must become European. You know, we gloss over it and we tend to dismiss that as just a political philosophy, but it's so far-reaching and so his vision of where we were going to be in the future is actually fascinating and striking at that particular time. And of course, we have this concept now that somehow or other, in the way it's taught, that Redmond and all of the rest of them were somewhat deluded, that half of them were West Brits and that they wanted to settle for some kind of a colonial entity. Well, I've a great time for Geróid Tuathaig, and in that book, which was written by, or put together by Brian Walker, Geróid Tuathaig says, the leaders of the nationalist home rule movement were comfortable with an Irish identity which could find institutional expression in a parliamentary assembly in Dublin, which is what they were looking for. It was an entity which combined a strong sense of patriotism and pride in membership of an ancient historic nation with an easy acceptance of Ireland's place, and the piece that's missing from the bottom of it is within the British Empire. That's what it says at the time. And that's where Kettle was coming from. That's where his political philosophy emerged from, and that's the context within which he operated. He was also a leading light in the Volunteers, which came along as a reaction to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers in 1912. And he enrolled with Lawrence, his brother, and he had an input into the Volunteer Manifesto. And we're going to look at that in a second. And the purpose of the whole thing was resisting the separatist intentions of the Ulster Volunteers in the north. That is the manifesto of the Irish Volunteers. You can find it online. Nobody reads it. It is well worth a read. Everyone kind of reads the proclamation or knows where to find it. Nobody reads that. But it is well worth reading in the context of its time. And I want to just look at one little piece which was in it. And this is Kettle all over it. British politics are controlled by British interests and are complicated by problems of great importance to the people of Great Britain. In a crisis of this kind, the duty of safeguarding our own rights is our duty first and foremost. They have rights who dare maintain them. And when you consider what we're going to talk about, the dream born in a herdsman shed in the sacred scripture of the poor, that's all the same stuff. It's all the same stuff. And it is where he found himself at that time. If we remain quiescent at by what title can we expect the people of Great Britain to turn aside from their own pressing concerns to defend us, will not such an attitude of itself mark us out as a people unworthy of defence? Defence, security, rights, everything that Kettle stood for is built into that. No comment about revolution, insurrection, overthrowing authority, none of it. Having said that, he was directly involved in trying to acquire weapons for the volunteers. And this is an interesting letter. This is a letter to Kettle from John Redmond when he was buying weapons for the volunteers in Belgium. And it says, "My dear Kettle, I congratulate you on the success of your efforts to obtain the rifles. Please store them all at the North Wall and in my name, with instructions to deliver them only to my, what does it say? Written order, correct. Yours sincerely, or yours truly, John Redmond." And again, it shows the two sides of what Tom Kettle was about. His role within the volunteer movement was very significant. He was in Belgium, he was acquiring weapons, and he was working directly with Redmond when Redmond took control of that particular organisation. Pearse, on the other hand, was writing letters to Devoy and McGarrity and a variety of others in the United States, complaining that he was being marginalised. Kettle was actually working intensely to acquire rifles for the volunteers. And when Germany invaded and the First World War started, Tom Kettle found himself in Belgium. And at that stage, he was doing two things. He was trying to sort out the situation with the rifles for the volunteers, but he was also working as a kind of war correspondent or a reporter for the Daily News. And he said, "It's impossible not to be with Belgium in this struggle. It is impossible any longer to be passive. Germany has thrown down a well-considered challenge to all the deepest forces of our civilization. In such a conflict, to counsel Ireland to stand neutral in judgment is as if one were to counsel a Christian to stand neutral in judgment between Nero and St. Peter. In such matters you cannot compromise. Neutrality is already a decision of adherence to the evil side." Clear, unequivocal, and understandable in the context of what he saw, what he witnessed, and how he wrote about it. And when he came back from that particular time in Belgium and from all of the horror which he had witnessed, he applied to join the army. Now, this was a rather complex operation. This gentleman here is General Sir Lawrence Parsons. He was essentially responsible for recruiting for the British Army in the south of Ireland. Draw a line from Dublin to Galway, and everything south of it was more or less his problem. He was brought out of retirement to do this. He was 63 or 64 years of age at the time. And he was under pressure from John Redmond, Maurice Moore, to give commissions to a variety of different people. Redmond wanted a lot of political people involved because he wanted to politicise the recruiting effort. Maurice Moore wanted the Irish volunteers, who were now under his control, to obtain commissions. And Kitchener basically just wanted him to get on with the job and put a unit together. And on the other side, you had Willie Redmond, who was looking for a commission because he felt he should be involved. You had Stephen Gwynn, who wanted to be involved as well, and Tom Kettle, of course, all looking to get involved in what was a militarization of society in our country at that particular time. And Parsons, to his credit, for the most part, said no. He didn't want a political military division formed in Ireland. He wanted soldiers who could fight. He wanted officers who were capable of leading the men and who had some understanding of the military conflict they were about to get into. And this posed a problem for Tom Kettle because he was first of all refused a commission, even though he was a very prominent individual in Irish society. And then he was given a commission. Then he was, his activities were restricted. And it all came down to suitability. Were any of these guys suitable? Taking these three as an example, were these guys suitable to become officers and to become leaders in what was now going to be a conflagration? And I have to say to you, the answer is no. The answer is no. Willie Redmond was too old. He was 53. Stephen Gwynn was 50. Kettle was 35 or 34, 35, and unwell. So by any stretch of the imagination, they really shouldn't have been allowed to participate. But because of the pressures coming from elsewhere, and because of the ultimate pressures of losing people on the Western Front, they all managed to find their way into the system. And without a doubt, the loss of Kettle and the loss of Redmond in battle later on certainly served this country rather badly. Kettle enlisted in November 1914, and he trained as a cadet of sorts in a company in Fermoy. There were doubts as to his suitability. He was finally commissioned on the 10th of March 1915, and his service was confined exclusively to recruitment. He was told, day one, you're not going anywhere, but you can go and you can get involved in the recruiting campaign. And notwithstanding that, there is a variety of requests from him and letters from him and others effectively begging to allow him to go to the front. But at this particular time, Pearse stood his ground and said no. He travelled extensively in Ireland. He gave over 200 speeches advocating that people should join the army. One lecture he gave, which has kind of gone down into a kind of historical note, was a Thomas Davis lecture that he had with Pearse, or a debate with Pearse. And these two set about debating the rights and wrongs of recruiting, joining the British Army, and so on. And I just want to do a comparison between the two of these, because in modern Ireland, one has priority and one is a historical footnote. Pearse was a Gaelic League activist. He was an insurrectionist. He was a member of a secret, subversive organisation called the IRB. He had a mandate from nobody. He wrote the proclamation. His political philosophy revolved around national isolation. He was a civilian in uniform. There's no record of him ever firing a shot in anger during the 1916 Rising. As per the proclamation, he was allied to Germany, and in most of his writings, he wanted to die. Kettle, on the other hand, was a politician and an academic. He was a Democrat. He stood for election, got a popular mandate, and became a member of Parliament. He had an input into the Volunteer Manifesto. His political philosophy revolved around European integration. At the end of the day, he was a leader in combat. He was a witness to the genocide on the Western Front, and he wanted to live. You couldn't have two more different people debating any particular argument if you tried. Mary Kettle said in Memoir, which is the first part of The Ways of War, she said that Pearse and Kettle were friends. I doubt it. I can't find any evidence that they were. They would have known each other for sure. They all knew each other. But as for being friends, no. Associates in academia, perhaps, but diametrically opposed when you put it on a chart like that. And yet, as I said, one is a national hero and the other is a historical footnote. An example of his recruiting activities: on the 7th of December 1915, he went to a recruiting conference in Cork. And just an example of how recruiting was controversial and divisive, a huge crowd turned up, but also 200 protesters. Kettle said that it was degrading for him to have to ask the young men of Cork to enlist. Now, that would, of course, be stirring it up to begin with. He recalled that when the victims of the Lusitania were being buried, the Friends of Germany in Cork had called for cheers for Germany. I mean, he's antagonizing the people who were in front of him. He said that they were simply seeking excuses for not fighting and that they were being paid from New York to obstruct recruiting. Well, perhaps not, but certainly there was a very big American influence in that. And walking to his hotel, he encountered 100 Sinn Féiners, and he walked into the middle of them shouting, "Cheers for the Cork revolutionary slackers and cowards." Not really the type of words that would be designed to win friends and influence people in that kind of situation. But also it indicates to me a certain almost manic courage that he was quite prepared to stand his ground and state his case for what he believed in. One way or the other, he wasn't assaulted, but the meeting ended in violence after the Loyalists and the Sinn Féiners clashed on Patrick Street. This is what was going on. So it indicates the type of activity Kettle was involved in, but also the tension that was involved in it. For not going to the front, even though Parsons and all of his staff wouldn't let him, Kettle got a lot of criticism. He continued to apply for active service. There was a chronic need for replacement officers on the Western Front after a very short period of time. He gave up drinking and tried to improve his health, and eventually he received a commission in the 9th Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And at Easter, he found himself in Newbridge and at home in Dublin on sick leave when this happened. And he was furious, as they all were. The best analysis of the reaction to that from those who were serving at the front actually comes from Emmett Dalton. Now, you have to take a lot of what Dalton says with a grain of salt as well, but Dalton he said publicly on numerous occasions that they felt totally and utterly betrayed by what had happened. And it wasn't so much the revolution itself, but it was the statement in the proclamation about the alliance with the gallant allies in Europe. And Kettle was furious, absolutely, as well. He believed that the free Ireland that he had been looking for in a European context was damaged. He was also distraught at the execution of the leaders, largely because he knew MacDonagh from UCD. He knew him very well. MacDonagh was also an academic. And of course, the whole issue in relation to the killing of Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who was his brother-in-law, you could not but be affected by it. And he also intervened at Owen MacNeill's court-martial to give evidence on his behalf. And of course, MacNeill was charged because he was the Chief of Staff of the Volunteers, but as we all know, the Volunteers as an organisation did not participate in the 1916 Rising. Nevertheless, that's what we were left with. And on the 14th of July, Tom Kettle sailed to France to join his unit. He was 36 years old when he deployed. And he deployed into this unit, which was the 16th Irish Division. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of this, just suffice to say a division is a military organisation. It's divided into brigades and battalions, and the numbers are flexible depending on any day of the week, effectively, depending on how many are there. But you're looking at somewhere in the region of 15 to 16,000 people if they were all there at the same time, but they never were. So the strength of that unit varied between 10 and 12,000 depending on what was going on, and also depending on the casualty figures they were taking. And he was in there in the 48th Brigade in the 9th Battalion of the Dubs. Now, while Kettle was back in Ireland and while the 1916 rebellion was taking place and all of that stuff, the rest of that unit had deployed to France. They went first to the UK, then they went to France. And they found themselves in March of 1916 in the area of Hullock and Lewes. And what I want you to look at here, maps are very confusing. Just concentrate on the black line. The black line is where the Western Front essentially was for the majority of the war. The rest of it is just how it moved over and back over time. But the black line is essentially the Western Front for all intents and purposes. And that's where his unit found itself when he deployed into it in July of 1916. Changes had taken place. Parsons was not allowed to go because he was too old. Most of the brigade commanders were fired because they were incompetent. Many of the officers down throughout the division were told service no longer required, we'll find somebody else, because they weren't up to the job. Now, if we just rewind it slightly, when Tom Kettle and Willie Redmond were making their initial requests to join, those were the very reasons given for not commissioning them. And yet, because of the pressure and because of the way the thing evolved, it changed. They were allowed to go to war, and it was wrong. It was the wrong decision, as it turned out, for both of them. And I mean that in a general sense, not in a vindictive way. And it's important to understand what was going on out there. This is just the 27th of April 1916, the same time the Easter Rising was happening in Dublin. 5 o'clock in the morning, a high bombardment. 10 minutes later, almost 4,000 cylinders of chlorine gas are released, and a couple of minutes after that, the German infantry advance right on top of the Irish soldiers who had deployed. This is a photograph from the time. That's a can of chlorine gas, and that guy is allowing the gas to escape. You'll note that the gas is going this way, and he's standing behind it, so obviously you don't stand in, you find out where the wind is, and you stand to one side of it. So when the wind is right, you can allow the gas to escape. And that's another example of the gas being set off, and the infantry standing quite happily behind it, waiting for the gas to do its work. In other words, to suffocate the enemy on the other side. In this case, the Irish division that we're talking about. This is an example of what it would have looked like. It's not per se from the 27th of April, but it's close enough. We have the soldiers, they know there's gas coming in, they can smell it, and of course what they have to defend themselves against it is pretty awful. In fact, almost useless. But that's what it was. And then we have the consequence of it afterwards for those who have managed to survive it. They're severely damaged and they are all out of battle. And of course, in a military context, if you can achieve this, then you don't have to kill them at all, because they're non-effective. Soldiers can't fight when they're suffering in this way, so you have achieved your military objective. You don't have to kill people to achieve a result. And in a sense, the gas was effective. It was also brutal. Those were the statistics for that particular day. For the Irish division alone, just for the Irish division alone, 2,000 casualties, 538 of them were killed, and many of the wounded, many of the rest of them died slowly. They would have been people in that line that we were looking at. 2 days later, they did it all over again. Exactly the same pattern, same effect. There are 93 or 94 names on that from the 8th and 9th Battalions of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and they're the guys who died in the gas attack in Hulloch on the 29th, the second gas attack. So just to prove the point that it was still, and I mean, if you consider that this is just one unit, these are the guys, the top one are from the 8th Battalion, the 9th Battalion are on the bottom. That is a huge amount of people. Think of the morale effect on everybody else who's left when this happens. So this many are killed, 3 times as many are casualties, and then what about those who have managed to survive it? Mentally, how do they adjust to that? The casualty figures for January to August, in January to May, 741 killed, 2,500 wounded, 187 missing, which means dead. June, July and August, slightly less in terms of killed, more or less the same about wounded, a few missing. The total number out of action, 6,161. That is phenomenal. That's just phenomenal. That's carnage. For any unit, anywhere, anytime, any war, that is just attrition gone mad. And that's what Tom Kettle arrived into. He arrived into a situation where all of this was going on, and those who were left behind were either damaged, scared, both, or just trying to do the best they could do. And he arrives into the middle of it, into something like this. The trench systems along that line were more or less like this. They were not like that later on, but at that particular time, because it was a kind of a static situation, it looked something like that. So when Kettle deployed, having spent effectively a year and a half demanding to go to the front, he got his wish, and he ended up in this, and he ended up with all of the residual baggage that was there from what had happened in April. And the shooting and the shelling didn't stop after April. It just kept going every day of every week. He wrote to General Hammond. Hammond was, at this stage, responsible for the reserve group of the 16th Division. He was based in the Curragh, and Kettle wrote him a letter. You don't have to read that. I'm going to tell you what it says. I'm just going to look at the top of it. These letters are in the National Library. They're well worth reading, and they give you an insight into what was really going on. We came right through to the front fire trench after 2 days at the base and got into a very heavily bombarded sector. We're now back in reserve. I had and am having a very bad time, not altogether because of fright, although I have suffered acute pangs of that, but because I feel myself at a great disadvantage in looking after and leading even a platoon as compared to the younger officers on the score of inferior physical activity. So he was He was frightened, and he was stressed, and he was finding the physical side of it very bad. I am glad at last, of course, to have kept my word with my recruits and to have come out to share their fortunes. It's all there in the first paragraph of that letter to Hammond. And it's sad, and he was petrified. And when you write that kind of stuff, any of us would write, no matter how scared we were, we wouldn't like to admit it, but when you drill down into it and you actually read between the lines, he found himself in a situation for which he wasn't trained, he wasn't prepared, he wasn't ready, and he was expected to do his job. And the reason he was expected to do it was because when he came into the line, they didn't say, here comes a guy with no experience. They said, here comes an officer with 2 pips on his shoulder, he's a lieutenant, lieutenant, do your job. That's how it works. It works the same everywhere. So there was an expectation that he would deliver. Mary Sheehy wrote in the memoir, which is the first part of The Ways of War, that Tom had said, physically I'm having a very heavy time. I'm doing my best, but I see better men than me dropping out day by day and wonder if I shall ever come home. The heat is bad, as are the insects and the rats, but the moral strain is positively terrible. He wasn't ready for it. In a letter to J.J. O'Mara, which was, this is it, this is out in the archives in UCD, he said, I came from Westland Row practically direct to the front line and have been here ever since. Chalk, lime, condensed milk, diabolical torturings of the air with unimaginable noises and blood, too much of it, are so far my main experience. We sleep on 2 sandbags and 4 ammunition boxes each. It goes on. Once in the war, had Germany conducted it according to the honourable conventions of soldiers, this might have been a mitigating circumstance, although it could not have availed substantially against her original mortal sin. I propose to prove on evidence and great volume of equal strength that once in the war she conducted it in Belgium and France with a planned barbarity, the details of which one almost recoils from writing down. So that's what he was going to do going forward. And having survived all of that in the Hulk-and-Luz region, they were all moved down a little bit further south into the area of the Somme. Now, this is the area of where the Battle of the Somme took place, 14 miles of front line, where everything that had been going on in the Hulk area was also going on prior to the 1st of July in the area further south. Yes, photographs in many respects speak for themselves, but on the morning of the 1st of July, the main attack took place. It was essentially done to relieve the pressure on the French in Verdun, and as I said, coming out of those kind of trenches, attacking into this kind of fortification was what took place on the 1st of July. 57,500 casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, almost 20,000 dead. I can't get my head around that. I doubt very much if you can either. It's beyond comprehension. But that's what it was. And why was it like that? It was like that because that's the way wars were fought. There's no point, you know, the traditional Blackadder story about, you know, when the general says, I'll be right behind you, and Blackadder says, yes, about 14 miles behind you. Well, that's where he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be 14 miles behind him because that's the way it was done. But the problem was there was some other thought process required. This could not possibly go on. Even the manner in which the artillery and the infantry worked together on the first days of the Battle of the Somme were prehistoric. It just didn't work properly. So this was a learning process for everybody as well, but look at the cost. Just phenomenal. So without going into any more than that, just let us be aware that that's what they came into as it went on and on. That was in July. In the beginning of September, Kettle and the 16th Division come into the area effectively for the first time. And they go into an area which we now know to be called Guillemot and Ginchy. And the first part of that was the battle for Guillemot. And basically, this is the village of Guillemot here. Not working. You can see it. And the idea essentially was to burst through those German red lines and take the village. That was the plan. This was the village of Guillemot before the war. Relatively pleasant. Somewhere you might even want to visit. And then, over time, all of July and all of August, between continuous shelling, continuous bombardment, it got turned into this. You can't see it. I mean, it's just there. The only thing that you can see or that can be identified effectively is the church, which is here in this particular area. But that is the result of continuous shelling forwards and backwards. And this is the area they were attacking into. Now, Kettle himself wasn't involved on the attack on Guillemot, but the 47th Brigade, which was part of the 16th Division, were. The rest of them were given other work to do. And effectively it meant coming out of trenches like this and going, trying to take the next line of trenches or to burst through that particular line of red trenches that I showed you. And he wrote the famous poem to his daughter on the 4th of September, while the mad guns curse overhead and tired men sigh with mud for couch and floor, know that we fools now with the foolish dead died not for flag nor king nor emperor, but for a dream born in a herdsman's shed and for the sacred scripture of the poor. In 2016, some lesser well-known poets in this country took issue with this and said this is not a very good poem and this is awful stuff. This is brilliant stuff. But they made no effort to understand what he was talking about in the context of the time. The dream born in a herdsman's shed is freedom. It's St. Patrick, it's whatever you want, but the dream born in a herdsman's shed is freedom. And for him it was Irish freedom he was talking about. And the sacred scripture of the poor is what it always is. It's human rights, it's liberty, it's equality, and it's all of that stuff. But even to write that in the context which I've showed you of sleeping on your ammunition box and being shelled out of your mind and people dying all around you, it's just phenomenal. As I said at the time, it's his epitaph, crafted in a world of unimaginable horror, with nothing save the stench of death for company and the cold sweat of fear soaking into every fibre of his body. I can't even describe that to you. I can't describe it. I have an idea in my head of what it might have felt like, but I can't describe it. It is beyond my comprehension, and at 100 years remove, it's definitely beyond yours as well, I would suggest. His dream was of a free, independent and united Ireland in a free Europe, and as I said, the sacred scripture was what it always was. And at the end of it, this is some photographs from the time, and these are from the area of Guillemot. And we're not talking about trenches as we saw in the earlier picture, we're talking about what's left. That was the railway station in Guillemot. There wasn't a lot left of it. The road into town. Soldier who didn't make it. More soldiers who didn't make it. Horses who didn't make it either. And the 47th Brigade, who were the main unit that were involved from the 16th Division, had 1,147 casualties, 1/3 of whom died. Now, they got 2 Victoria Crosses out of it, if that's any consolation for Private Hughes and Lieutenant John Vincent Holland. But, I mean, what's going on there is burial insofar as they can find anything to bury. But I would ask you to look at the terrain. Look at how, you know, it's just shell holes all over the place. Now, they were lucky it was somewhat dry. Put water on top of that, then you get into the Passchendaele scenario. Ernest Younger wrote a book called Storm and Steel from the German perspective, and he came into the line in the Guillemot area at that particular time, and he survived. But this is what he wrote. He said houses had been ground to powder, the railway station had been smashed to bits. I think we can agree with that. Among the living lay the dead. As we dug, we found them in layers stacked one upon the other. The corpses were covered with masses of soil turned up by the shell. The next company advanced in place of the fallen. So when the first crew got so far and couldn't go any further, the guys who came behind them leapfrogged over them and tried to continue the attack. More photographs of that particular place at that particular time. There's no glory in this. There's nothing nice about it. And when it's over, you come back and you regroup and you try to go again with whatever's left. And you go back into this. This were the trench systems that were a little bit further back where there would be some security, but as you can see, some security and no facilities. And further to the rear then, you will have a convoy of military vehicles which will take people out of the line, because once a unit has been put in and it fights and it's broken to pieces, whatever is left, you take them out and you put in a new unit to try and continue the fight. And that is precisely what they did, and this is where Tom Kettle comes into it. So having got through Guillemot, having got through those red lines, and having taken their front line to where I have the green line marked on the map, the next objective was the village of Ginchy. And the reason they wanted to do that was because they wanted to straighten the overall front line. They didn't want to have a salient. After Guillemot, there was continuous fighting, little movement, casualties mount up, and on the 6th of September, the entire front line in that area was held by Irish battalions. On the 5th of September, Hickey was given all of his units back together again. The attack was planned. The bombardment would start at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the attack would go in at 4:45 in the afternoon, which meant they were going to go into position the night before. They were going to sit in position all day, and we're not talking trenches, we're talking about holes in the ground. And if they didn't get shelled to pieces during the day, then they were going to get up and go and attack the village at 5 o'clock that afternoon. The logic behind that was that if they attacked late, that the Germans wouldn't have the ability to mount a counterattack in daylight. I don't know what genius came up with that, but that was the plan. It wasn't a very good one. Anyway, they began to position their units. Kettle talks about, in a lot of his written work and in his letters, he talks about going through Trones Wood, defending Bernafay Wood. These are areas around that particular area. These were the woods. There was no woods left. There was no cover. They were just hammered to pieces. And they just got damaged more and more as it went on. And on the 9th of September, the battle for Ginchy took place. And as I said, they were now, having moved through the village of Guillemot, they now wanted to move that front line further and move it to the northeast, in this case, the northeast of Ginchy. So the attack took place. That's what was left of, that's what they were attacking. This is what Ginchy looked like. This is an aerial photograph taken by the Royal Flying Corps at that particular time. And you can see it's marked as Ginchy on the bottom here, and that crossroads that you're looking at, and it's nothing, it's just powder, it's rubble. It's what Ernest Younger was talking about. The plan was that the 48th Brigade would lead, the 47th Brigade would support them, each battalion would have 4 companies in line, and each company would be on a platoon frontage. So in other words, they shrunk the whole thing down, because we're not talking about a huge field, a huge area. They shrunk everything down. So if you have a company which is basically 100 people, normally they should be spread out over 200 meters. A platoon is 30 people. They should be, 100 meters or less. But what they did was they shrunk them all down to try and move them along together and to have command and control. Their artillery was supposed to start at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they were to be relieved by the Guards Brigade after they had taken their objective. We have a map. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I do want to show you this. This was the plan. The plan was that that unit, which is inside this area here, that line, that's where they were. The plan was to go forward and attack and to take Ginchy village, which was the first objective, and then to move on further north of it and reorganize on the second objective, which was further, a little bit further to the north, maybe 100, 200 meters. Standard military stuff, nothing wrong with that. In relation to where Tom Kettle found himself, they were over on that side, on the left side of the attack. The Royal Irish Rifles were supposed to go forward and take the first objective, and then Kettle's battalion was supposed to go forward, leapfrog through them, which is a loose term, but nevertheless that's what they were supposed to do, or fight their way through them and move on to the second objective. That's what he was trying to do. And the night before Ginchy, he said, and this is the only photograph we have of him in uniform, and there is, what a transformation from the college professor, the academic, the politician, to this. It's from sanity to madness. It's from normality to complete abnormality, and trying to work and exist within a context for which he wasn't fit, he shouldn't have been there, and he wasn't really trained properly. Nevertheless, I am calm and happy, but desperately anxious to live. Contrast that with the guys who went into the GPO. The big guns are coughing and smacking their shells, which sound for all the world like overhead express trains at anything from 10 to 100 rounds per minute on this sector. The men are grubbing, and an odd one writing home. Somewhere the choosers of the slain are touching, as in our Norse story, they used to touch with invisible hands those who are to die. This document is out in UCD. It is Tom Kettle's company commander's orders on the day of the attack. This is an incredible document. For, as I said, for a guy with no training, who shouldn't have been where he was, and who was petrified and scared out of his mind, he wrote this document. When I joined the army back in the 70s, we used these because we didn't have computers and we didn't have mobile phones. And what it is it's a message pad, message and signals across the top of it. When you write on it, it duplicates. So you can have 3 or 4, you can make 3 or 4 copies quite cogently by just writing, and if you write heavy on it, you'll get the copy in the second page and so on. And that's what that is. And he got everything right. He was the company commander. He shouldn't have been the company commander, but there was nobody else left. And he said to his 2 platoon commanders, there are machine gun positions at X, Y, and Z. Bombers should be told off to try and get at them before they can get the guns into action after the barrage passes. In other words, once the artillery stop, make a preemptive strike and try and take the machine guns out. That's what he said to them. Companies will have to make a tight line at the start for a short distance. If at time of advance the 8 dubs who were on their right proceed forward from shell hole to shell hole, we will do likewise. Good idea. No point being left behind and being caught. The object being to be as close as possible to our creeping barrage. In other words, to have some protection from the artillery that we're firing. The battalion commander will take up position to the rear of the 4th wave, which is where he should have been. And the companies, when relieved, will move independently southwest. That's the following day. 0 hour, 5:45, time of our advance, 5:25, unless we creep forward in conjunction with the 8 dubs and halt until 5:25 and so on. Please organise so as to have 3 or 4 bombers on each of your flanks. Absolutely right. Flank security, every company commander should detail. To Lieutenant Bird, please try to get in touch with A Company and arrange to have movement of the 8 dubs communicated to you at once. Communicate the message to Sergeant Kelly from Tom Kettle, OCB Company, at 10 to 11 in the morning. That document is just incredible. For a guy in that context, in that time, trying to manage the resources and the assets that he had to achieve an effect in the most horrible circumstances any of us could imagine. I spent 42 years in the military. I was trained to do this kind of stuff. I didn't do that. I doubt very much if I could, because you have to be able to function in an abnormal circumstance and to do it well. And in a sense, the madness becomes the normal. And for Kettle, that is true, but nonetheless, he managed to put that together. It's an incredible document. Most people don't even know it exists. And these are photographs from Ginchy. So what we have a situation, this is not like Blackadder, let's all go over the trench and blow the whistle and the best of luck, lads. None of that, because we're not dealing with the same terrain. The trenches are all at the wrong angle. They're just holes in the ground anyway. So basically, you go forward in a line and you get up and try and move forward. And as you can see, they're very closely packed together. Now, you can argue that that makes a better target for those who are trying to attack you, but nevertheless, it's easier for command and control, so it's a trade-off. But nevertheless, that's what they did. Here's another example of it. You can see them moving forward, but you can also see the shells going off in the distance. So the artillery has moved ahead of them, and it's dropping shells, hopefully on top of the enemy and not on top of them. But of course, that's not what happened either. There we have a group making their way forward, and the shells falling all around them. A group trying to recover bodies from the battlefield with shells going off around them. Medics trying to bring people back. More people being evacuated. Some guys who just managed to find a safe hole in the ground and stay in it. Likewise, an abnormal terrain. And this is a horrible photograph. This is a photograph after the battle. And what is going on here is the way it works. If people, you know what you start with. So if you start with 100 people, you know who they are. But if they don't, some of them don't come back, and if some of them can't be found, and if their bodies disappear off the face of the earth the only way of knowing who's missing is to count the backpacks. So they leave the backpacks after them when they begin the attack, because you don't want to carry this stuff with you. It can be brought up later. So the way you do it is you put all the backpacks out on the ground and say, when they come back, take your pack and move on. And whatever's left is whatever's missing. They're the ones who didn't come back. So there's a high probability in that particular photograph that one of those backpacks belonged to Tom Kettle and several others. And then as you move the casualties further back, it becomes more normal, if that's the word, because you're out of the range of the enemy fire, and people get patched up and they get moved on, and they either go home or get better or get put back into the line. So, having made his way through all of that, the choosers of the slain chose Tom Kettle. He had tried to outwit them by wearing some kind of a primitive bulletproof vest, but that didn't work. And he didn't want to die. He simply wanted to do his duty, survive the war, go back into a kind of a rear area, do some more work and go home. And his numerous writings which survive him make that abundantly clear. And for anybody to suggest that in some way that he had the same kind of death wish as Padraig Pearse, that's an abomination to even make that suggestion, because it is patently untrue. Between the 3rd and the 9th of September, from an initial strength of 11,000, now it should have been more, but I told you that figures vary, these were the casualty figures. So 224 officers and 4,090 other ranks were out of battle. Okay, 1,067 of them died between the 3rd and the 9th of September. That's taking into account the attack on Guillemot and then the attack on Ginchy. So those are the statistics. So we're looking at a casualty rate there of 4,000, almost 46%, which is huge. And units can't continue. I mean, units just get decimated. If you can't sustain those kind of losses and continue to be functional, you just can't. This was a letter written to Mary Kettle on the 22nd of September by Colonel Thackeray, who was the commanding officer of the unit. He said, "I'm writing to console you in the great loss which you've sustained, the death of your husband. He met his death gallantly, leading his company in a victorious attack. He was hit by a bullet and his death was instantaneous." Now, Emmett Dalton would have you believe that he gave him, he said, a Decade of the Rosary or whatever he did, and when he met him, I don't believe Dalton for a minute. I think Dalton was something of a Walter Mitty character anyway, but if Dalton was where he said he was in the wrong place. And I'm going to show you in a minute, I know exactly where Tom Kettle was when he died. If Dalton was where he said he was in the wrong place. Dalton should have been way over to his right, and he shouldn't. Having said that, after the battle, to console people, people say all kinds of things. You know yourself from going to funerals, you say things and they're half right, and it's all done with the best intentions to console people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. This map is another map from the time, and these maps are exceptionally useful now because they allow us to pin down and to identify exactly where people were on the battlefield. So I showed you the original map, which was where they were. This line here is where the 8 dubs were. Sorry, the 9 dubs were here, the 8 dubs were here. This is A Company, that's B Company. That's where Tom Kettle was. Somewhere in this area, that's where Tom Kettle was. So it allows us to be very clear in relation to what happened. This is a horrible map. This is a portion of a map which was constructed after the war by those who went to retrieve bodies from the battlefield. Okay? So, in these little grid squares that are here, which are about 150 meters by 150 meters, this tells us how many bodies they managed to pull out of the battlefield after the war. I'll just move that on slightly. Right, let's go down to Guillemot. This is Guillemot village, this is Ginchy. So out of these areas you can see the numbers of bodies that they found. Doesn't mean that they identified them all, they just found bodies. Because in some of the cemeteries, some of these would be known only to God, because they wouldn't be able to identify who they were, but they would have found something. And you can see in this particular area, after the war was over and back on numerous times, 160 people, 160 bodies here, 71. In the area where Tom Kettle was, 84. A little bit further north of it, 29, 151 on this side of the road with the 8 dubs and so on. And if you look at some of the other ones are horrendous altogether. Up here in this area north of Delville Wood, 749 out of an area 150 metres by 150 metres. So if you want to understand the intensity of the fighting and the impact it had on those who were trying to attack, that map says, I mean, it's just so sad. And as I said, those were the ones that they found, okay? In Kettle's case, he wasn't found. I took this photograph on the 9th of September 2016. I went to Guillemot. There was almost nobody there, except 1 or 2 people from the Cork branch of the Western Front Association who came along. This is the field where Tom Kettle died. This is the road from Guillemot to Ginchy. Tom Kettle died somewhere here. Emmett Dalton was somewhere here. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to attack this particular village, which was Ginchy, which has now been regenerated and recultivated and so on. But that is the field where Tom Kettle died. I'm absolutely certain of it. I've walked it, searched for further evidence of it. There's all kinds of evidence on the battlefield, as those of you who've been there know, but that's where Tom Kettle died. Absolute tragedy, as I said. He wasn't trained for it. He shouldn't have been there. And yet he felt an overwhelming moral obligation to go, the same as Willie Redmond did, which was, don't go, but come with me. And he went, and he fought, and he died. And then we talk about remembering. Well, he was remembered on the 1st of July 2016. He was remembered in Guillemot. He was remembered in Stephen's Green on the 9th of September. I've got the photograph of you, Declan, but you were all there. And he was remembered in the House of Commons by Geoffrey Donaldson, who's over there on the left-hand side. Even though he wasn't an MP at the time, his name is on the wall. And there, the the WFA Cork branch and some members of the Munster Fusiliers Association who visited Guillemot at the 16th Division Memorial on the 9th of September 2016, and we gathered around it, and we had, strangely enough, a conversation like we're having today at that particular time, but there was nobody else. Tom Kettle is remembered on the Cheapval Memorial. The Cheapval Memorial, 72,000 other people who disappeared off the face of the earth during the Battle of the Somme. 72,000 people disappeared. I mean, that's just take Croke Park on All-Ireland final day and just remove them all. That's what it is. It's frightening, but that's where he is. He's remembered in Messines. That's the round tower in the Island of Peace, the Island of Ireland Peace Park, and the poem to Betty is there on one of those tablets that you can see just along the side of the footpath. And he's remembered in St. Stephen's Green. I have a problem with this. There were problems with it all along, in that there was a row over what should be on the inscription, but nowhere there does it say he was in the Dublin Fusiliers, and nowhere there does it say he died in the Battle of the Somme. It says all kinds of other things, and maybe it's better than nothing, but it's not complete. 3 questions going forward. Who will remember the Irish dead of the Great War in the future? Who will ensure that Ireland has an inclusive historical narrative? Who will remember Tom Kettle, or is he destined once again to become a historical footnote? This was William Hickey. William Hickey was the divisional commander for most of the war up until 1918, when he became unwell. But Hickey, on the 8th of November 1924, so long after the war was over, he spoke to the Irish Society in Oxford, and he said a number of things, but he said, "No subject has been more misunderstood, unrecognised, or more willfully misrepresented than the part the men of Ireland played in the Great War." I'm going to read that again, because it's so true. No subject has been more misunderstood, unrecognised, or more willfully misrepresented than the part the men of Ireland played in the Great War. Thank you.